All right, it's 11 o'clock. Let's get started. First, I think on the agenda is, so we have all three members of the subcommittee and Brett and Janelle here. Bob, I really want to thank you for the minutes from the January 6th and the January 28th meeting. Are there any comments on them?
You can't actually discuss them because they're not on the agenda. So I'll get them on the agenda for next meeting.
Okay.
Can I offer a couple of simple edits that I don't think anybody should take issue with? There were references, I think it was in the second group.
Actually, you cannot discuss this because it's not on the agenda.
Right.
And I just need to keep us legal and on topic. But yeah, if you've got comments, send them to me or Bob, because I just fixed like something that Brent's with GMB. So it just little things, just let us know. So they will be on the agenda for next meeting.
Great. All right. And then I guess let's move on to the agenda items. So Janelle, where are we at right now?
So right now, what we're doing is discussing how do we want to address how do we figure out base flood elevation for the 500 year for redevelopment. And that is where we are at.
Well, I think it's the base flood elevations in general.
Well, we don't need to determine how we calculate the base flood elevations for VE, AE in the floodplain in the 100 year because they exist. The discussion really was for in areas of the 500 year, if we're going to allow for critical facilities to be built in the 500 year, how are we calculating the base flood elevation? And there was significant discussion at the last meeting about the proposal that Brent brought forth, which had like, you know, if there was a BFE established, you'd go with that. And then there was next steps going down to how to get to that. And I know there was concern because we spent a lot of time, and I think there was concern that at some point we were going to end up with the 500 year being built higher than what we are planning for the 100 year. Because there was discussion about, you know, and I know we don't like using the word, but we were talking about the fudge factor. But what we have is, you know, typically the 500 year is typically a little bit higher. And again, floodplain is rounded up. So if you can figure out the base flood elevation or use the adjacent 100 year flood of elevation, again, with the understanding that 100 year is probably lower than your 500 year, just typically how that works. And then we add our 18 inches and we add our sea level rise, that should address the concern of building within the 500 years floodplain.
So if two corrections from my perspective is critical facilities, base flood elevation is not only for new developments, it's also for any critical facility, because the federal government mandates or the FEMA rules are that you should try to locate critical facilities outside the 500-year floodplain period.
Yes, and that's how the code is currently written. But if you cannot, then there were options of how to figure out the base flood elevation for the 500 year because it has not been identified by FEMA.
Right, and that's where Brent had in providing the stud survey, flood survey, it does have 500-year flood elevations.
Yes.
So the discussion last meeting was on using either the firm map or the flood survey or the 100-year, and
adjacent,
since
yeah.
we have the flood survey, and that by definition has to be a higher elevation than the 100-year, I don't see any reason to include the 100-year, or if we are going to use the 100-year, we need to use an offset. Bob, Sumner, Brett, do you have feelings?
So I guess now is when I'll thank Brent for his efforts in sharing the flood insurance study volumes with us. I actually made an effort to read through the 3 studies. Of course, the volumes 2 and 3 are largely just graphs and tables to support the valuable, really valuable text that's in volume 1. And although a lot of that volume is about longitudinal stream profiles and figuring out floodways and so on in stream environments, there's a whole section on coastal flooding, which I think is very relevant to what we're dealing with here. And as I said just before the call, it helped me sort of understand the black box that has always been how flood maps are made, and it was extremely useful. And I have a number of questions, which maybe I'll ask now or I'll get in touch with Brent about. But thinking about all the stuff that we talked about last time, I know I was confused, and I'm just wondering if it actually went back and looked at our floodplain ordinance. And the more I thought about that sort of 4-tiered process that Brent had put out in draft form last time, and I think caused some confusion, it seems to me, I mean, I'll just throw this out here and we can deal with this later, but I think there's a whole lot that might be cleared up if we tried to integrate a lot of what we're doing back into the floodplain ordinance itself, back into 197.73 and its various sections. And I'll draw particular attention in regards to what Tom was just saying to, I think it's the section, it's section A, floodplains, general provisions, A, 4, in parentheses 4, which is the basis for establishing special flood hazard areas. And under that, there are 5 different items that sort of give a sort of an order of operations for figuring out whether or not, you know, you're in a special flood hazard area. And the more I thought about what we were talking about last time, the more I wondered about the items that are numbers 4 and 5, and I'll read them out right here. Number 4 says the City of Lewis may identify, the first couple talk about the FEMA flood insurance study, which is the thing that Brent sent us. The FEMA flood insurance rate maps, that's number 2. And then other hydrologic, number 3 is other hydrologic and hydraulic engineering studies and maps, blah, blah, blah. Number 4 says the City of Lewis may identify and regulate new flood hazard or ponding areas. These areas should be delineated and adopted on a, quote, local flood hazard map using best available topographic data and locally derived information, such as flood of record, historic high water marks, or approximate study methodologies. I think there's things that we might do there. But the 5th one was the one that I think most directly applies, and I'm hoping maybe Robin can weigh in on this, to the conversation we have right now about elevations, where field surveyed topography indicates that ground elevations are below the closest applicable base flood elevation, even in areas not delineated as special flood hazard area on a flood hazard map. The area shall be considered as a special flood hazard area. To me, this offers an opportunity to simplify this calculus that we're going through. Yeah. Am I reading that right?
So I think we're looking at 2 different things. We're recognizing the floodplain. The code recognizes the floodplain, but what we're trying to do is add a level of, we recognize sea level rise. So sea level rise in addition to the floodplain. So the floodplain's not going to change, well, floodplain regulations, again, there's another subcommittee looking at those. So we're looking at floodplain regulations, and on top of that, we're looking at, okay, we see sea level rise happening. How do we want to address that? I don't want to start completely combining them, because while they overlap and they integrate together, they are definitely two different things that we need to address. And I think, and I know Robin has said this before, and I've added him so he can unmute and talk. I'm not sure we want to add. There's difficulty in creating our own separate flood area. Is that right, Robin?
He has to unmute himself.
Yeah,
So while Robin's working on that, I'll say the 4-stepped approach that I sent out and we were discussing last time, that only applies to new public critical facilities. And that's it. That's all that those 4 apply to. Now, if they do ever come up with a BFE for the 0.2%, then it's on the map. So we're already there. If not, they've got it in the flood insurance study. So what we can do is put 1 and 2, take off 3 and 4. And then I think we've got new critical facilities in the 0.2% flood hazard area completely covered. Because under IBC, under state code, under local code, you can't build in the 1%. So
well, let me suggest that I would agree with taking off 3 and 4 as maybe reducing complication, but in the study you sent over, if you dig down to about page 90 something or other, you get to the fact that there's a difference of about 1.6, 1.7 feet between those two. If I remember correctly, it's
we're not even looking at the 0.1% BFE. Looking at just strictly the 0.2. That's listed in the flood insurance study.
But the 100-year is down about 1.6 feet. And so if you then go back to the point Sumner was making, was if you have a sea level today's and the 500-year, you add to it sea level rise plus the difference between the two, you're going to flood nearby land. And I come back around to where Sumner was, that you have to say that's included, and you write it into that section that Sumner was talking about.
So this is why Janelle, this is why I sent that graphic around. It comes from page 102 of the volume 1 flood insurance study. It's it's called the figure 3 transect schematic, and it basically shows a very simplified diagram of the different flood zones that are relevant in the flood mapping process. And I think does a really nice job of illustrating the different relevant elevations that we're kicking around in this discussion. And at least the way I look at it, and I may have it all wrong, you know, when we're talking about these different timeframes for sea level rise, we're basically having to go out and generate a lookup on a table based on the time frame. Is it 40 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 80 years? That's based on the predictions of sea level rise, maybe the intermediate curve or whatever it might be from the Delaware Technical Sea Level Rise Committee. And if you look at this figure 3 transect schematic, you know, it's a vertical buffer on several of these curves that are in this image. And to me, with sea level rise, there are going to be areas adjacent to the 100-year floodplain that are going to be activated because the water is going to rise. And at least the way I look at it is there's a simple way to sort of evaluate all this. If we all come to terms and agree on the relevant elevations for a given class of facility, whether it be a critical facility or redevelopment or new development, and we pick a time frame and we pick therefore a sea level rise value, then we should be able to say, here's the critical elevation that matters in a given portion of the city landscape. That's a calculation that should be pretty easy for a landowner, for Robin to figure out. You know, we're building a vertical buffer effectively rather than a horizontal buffer to what we already have with the existing FEMA-based floodplain regulations. This is why I bring up this point about the section 5 of the floodplain stuff I just read a minute ago. Yes, there's another group looking at floodplains, but no, that does not mean that we shouldn't figure this out because it's already there. We already have the ability to manage this problem, if I'm reading this right here.
So if I might say it this way, you know, part of the problem, part of what we're trying to do though is eat the elephant in bites. And if you remember very, very early on, Janelle had put out, you know, had explained and shown us on the graphics with the bathtub curve. And I recognize that static water level, but that the difference between the 100-year floodplain and sea level rise is a very, very narrow band of land. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't address that in the future, but right now, if we can attack the 100-year floodplain for new development and redevelopment, and the 500-year for the critical facilities, we will get 80 to 90% of our current risk. And then we can look at these other areas, and I'm fully behind looking at what the benefits of a special flood map down the line. But if we try to take that on now, there's no way we're going to get anything on the books immediately.
And I also think, again, remember, we've already addressed how we're addressing development within the 100-year. We've given it its time frame. It's how many years out, depending if you're redevelopment or a critical facility. We've already got and that's already got a determined base flood elevation. We've got our freeboard. So take your sea level rise, add your freeboard. We've got that. What this discussion is just how are we all don't want critical facilities built in the 500-year, but if they happen to be, how do we figure out the base flood elevation? And based on some of the information Brent has provided, now we have that data. So if you're going to build there, you're going to use that data or the information from the flood study. So I think we've addressed how we're calculating the base flood elevation for the 500-year. And I know we talked about it doing it in critical facilities, and I know you've also discussed about, do we add that to the redevelopment portion? So we did add, if you're going to build in the 500-year for redevelopment, again, you're meeting that definition of substantial damage or substantial improvement. And then we added that calculation of how do we figure out what the base flood elevation is? And again, it would be if it's defined or what is coming from the FEMA flood study, which Brent has said now has some information in it that I think we can move forward with.
Can you show me the calculation for a given spot?
At a given spot, it'll be whatever the flood elevation is, the BFE and the flood study, plus the 18 inches, plus the, if it's a critical facility, the 80-year sea level rise. If it's a redevelopment, it'll be the 50-year sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wondered about is if we should put this together in some sort of tabular format to help clarify all this. Where you have one axis that has, you know, what kind of a facility you're looking at. Is it critical facility? Is it redevelopment? You know, something that gets at all those different timeframes. And then ideally it would have something that would say, here's the lookup that I was referring to earlier, the number of inches or feet or whatever, based on the sea level rise predictions above the standard BFE plus freeboard?
Well, I think what Bob has provided in an Excel spreadsheet would be potentially a good table to include, because it does start with BFE. And I mean, this needs to be cleaned up a little bit, Bob, but I think it's an excellent start. And then states with the sea level rise, 40, 80, 50 year, whatever we decide that we're going to put in the final ordinance. And then the calculations that show how much freeboard, how much sea level rise for what the total is. So I think what Bob started.
I did that to try to understand it myself.
No, yeah, and that's excellent.
And I appreciate, I think it was very helpful. Putting that into the ordinance is a concern, because if we ever change the base freeboard, then we have to change the ordinance. And we've already recognized, and I know, Bob, you were just kind of doing it for an example. And I know, Tom, I just want to explain to, like, we've got 6 people on the line. My concern about putting that into an ordinance, or something like that, is because those numbers are going to change.
Well,
your sea level rise is going to change, and then that's the reason we referenced that where the sea level rise numbers are coming from, because that way we are not stuck. And as better data comes available, we are going with the better data.
So if we put it in there as rather than freeboard 18 inches, if we put it in as freeboard and the code section, because I, as an engineer, don't like the same number in 2 places either. But I think the chart of what all's in there would be, and as Brent said, it's just a formula. It's BFE plus X amount of sea level rise plus freeboard. And BFE is dependent upon whether it's the 500 year or the 100 year, depending upon what type of facility it is. And I think that's what Bob's table does well.
Is it possible you can put that table up on the screen?
Give me just a minute.
So this is just the big brother of construction in the 1%, because the 1% is the BFE where you're constructing plus freeboard. This is the BFE of the 0.2 plus freeboard plus sea level rise. Correct. So it's just the big brother of what we already have.
Yeah, and the way the code is written, it says if you're in the 1%, see, where is it? That you're building out to 40 year with BFE. And then, so I'm just going to read how we've defined redevelopment. If it's consistent with substantial damage or substantial improvement as defined by the code, shall comply with the 50-year sea level rise in addition to freeboard requirement defined by the city code. So we are already referencing the city code for how we calculate freeboard. And that is also the same as the 0.2. It's if you build within the 0.2 for critical facilities, you're using 80-year sea level or the projected design of the life for the building, which we've discussed, in addition to the freeboard requirement defined by the code. So we've got that. You've got the and I don't know a better, and I know you were talking about like how to tabulate it, but I think we've already said sea level rise this year, this number, freeboard, and then how are you figuring out, and like and if you're in the 500 year, how do you figure out your base flood? Because we already know that for the 100 year. Does that make sense? Is that the code recognizes it's giving you your sea level rise number. It's saying you got to comply with the freeboard requirement as defined by the code. And then we've just added for those items in the 500 year, how to figure out your base flood elevation.
So one of the things that I found myself wondering, and I'm sorry, I'm going to throw this into the mix. What about having variable freeboard based on these different calculations, these different classes of land class? Are we looking at a critical facility in the 100 year? Are we looking at a critical facility in the 500 year? And therefore there would be different freeboard values based on the sea level rise numbers. I mean, would it make Robin's job any easier to have just a simple lookup of freeboard values based on the situation you fall in?
I'm going to speak for Robin and he can yell at me later, but I'm pretty sure it'll make his life a little bit more difficult because he's not the only one. But if you already know, your freeboard is 18 inches, it's just 18 inches across the board. And remember, for like those critical facilities, we're looking at the 80-year horizon, which means you're raising that up much higher than the 50-year or the 40-year. And then you still have to build in that 18 inches of freeboard. So I think we've already built that in to get that higher for those critical facilities.
Yeah, and I would much rather we chose, if we want to do that, Sumner, I would much rather we choose a further point out on the sea level rise curve. And I'm not proposing we do that, than have variable freeboard. Freeboard is kind of an uncertainty number. And so I think having a consistent freeboard over BFE 100-year, BFE 500-year is probably a cleaner way of writing a code.
So you're just acknowledging that the 18-inch current freeboard is the fudge factor, our insurance policy.
Let's please not use that word anymore.
Well, but effectively that's what you've just said.
It's giving us extra security. And Danielle just goes safety margin. So I'm using extra security.
Fine. Safety margin.
Danielle is calling it the safety margin, which I think that's what we're looking at, is the extra protection the freeboard provides.
And it also helps you get a better rate.
Correct. And understand that can change over time as well, if we so choose. We don't have to do 18 inches. We could go to 2 feet.
That's a political decision?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. I'm not.
I mean, is that how we came up with that 18 inches?
I honestly.
18 inches is kind of a,
standard.
everybody went to it as a bare minimum. Okay. Because back when the 18 inches was not to get down a rabbit hole, but that was kind of where the really good insurance rate was, if you were 18 inches above. And
the state recommended it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a CRS. Is this related to CRS?
No. Your individual policy, if you were 2 feet above, then you kind of got the prime rate. So they built in 18 inches just so contractors couldn't cut corners. I mean, there were like 5-fold reason to land at 18 inches. But so contractors couldn't cut corners. You were getting a better rate. It built in sea level rise at the time. So when this thing came about, 5-10 years ago, you kind of built 18 inches into it already. Volatility of storms, potential wave action from either side. There were all sorts of reasons to build that 18 inches in, but it kind of became an adopted amount for everybody. Some people have chosen to go higher. Mm-hmm. Some people have chosen not to adopt the 18 at all.
Yeah, so I mean, since the insurance companies are the ones who were kind of the impetus, and it is fairly universally accepted, you have to assume that the insurance companies have some actuarial basis for what risks they're going to take or not. So as Brent said, we can go higher, but I think we need to stick with the sea level rise curves and the probability of the sea level rise curve and a year on the sea level rise curve and the established freeboard.
So is everybody comfortable now of how we're addressing and figuring out the base flood elevation for the 500-year, which is if it's already designated or what's determined from the FEMA flood insurance study?
Yes, if we leave it to
as an engineer that would be calculating it, yes.
Okay, so I've gotten rid of 3 and 4. And again, those are both in redevelopment and critical facilities, because we recognize that you could be redeveloping in the 500-year. And did I get the terminology right? Brent, it's the FEMA flood insurance study?
Flood insurance study, yes.
Thank you. So
are we being hasty here with 3 and 4, particularly 4? Is there a situation where we want 4 in the mix?
No, because the flood study has an elevate. It does not matter what the grade is. The flood study is going to give you a flood elevation. So it doesn't matter if the grade's 5. If the flood study tells you that your flood elevation is 11, you're starting at 11. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter what the grade is.
Agreed.
Okay.
Because again, go ahead, Bob.
Well, I think you can come back and address those special flood hazard areas with an elevation.
Yeah, the special flood hazard areas, the 100-year with the VE and the AE already have a designated base flood elevation. So we already know what those are. So we're good there. And again, it's whatever that number is, freeboard, sea level rise year.
Sumner's talking about adding sort of adjacent areas with the sea level rise. And they would...
So yeah. I mean, this is why I brought up and I read specifically 4A5 in our floodplain regulation. And it says where field surveyed topography indicates that ground elevations are below the closest applicable base flood elevation. So far, that sounds like something where we're looking at detailed elevation information relative to the numbers that we've just determined in 1 and 2 in our rubric. Even in areas not delineated as a special flood hazard area on a flood hazard map, the area shall be considered as a special flood hazard area. So this is taking best available topographic information and comparing it, even if the area isn't mapped as currently by FEMA as a special flood hazard area. It's just looking at the elevation, the landscape.
Right. I'm going to tell you so if we go with the 0.2% flood elevation, you're going to have 75% of the town or city below that elevation.
It may be inconvenient. Well, it won't be 75% of the town. There are certain areas where 75% of the land will be under that elevation. That's kind of why I'm bringing this up. If we're going to take this seriously, I think we seriously need to be considering the future water levels in portions of the city's domain.
And I think we have taken it very seriously. We've spent almost an entire year discussing this. And I think what we've also recognized is we recognize that the flood maps will most likely change in the future. And the 100-year will most likely increase, which then pushes the 500-year out to increase a little bit. So we're putting that safety margin into the code already because we're recognizing land's going to change over time, and we expect more of the city to fall into the floodplain of the 100-year or the 500-year. And I think we've kind of figured that out already based on how things have happened in the past. And so I think we've taken that into consideration. And I think we've got a really good draft ordinance that I think is ready for the commission to consider. There's, again, we need to look at—
clarify something?
Yeah.
If I understand everything that's been said so far, well, let me ask it this way. If I have a property that is outside of a currently identified special flood hazard area, according to FEMA, 100-year, 500-year, if I'm in zone X, unshaded, what is going to be my requirement if, what matters to me in terms of figuring out what elevation I'm building at?
So currently, it's not regulated under the floodplain because it's not designated as a floodplain. The option you have is to just use a across the board 18-inch freeboard and then go back to the building code and then add in that 18 inches, even if you're outside a designated area.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about that because
that's a whole nother ball of wax, and that's beyond what we're looking at here with the regulated floodplain area per the firm maps that have been adopted by the town that are applicable documents.
The building codes currently require a 6-inch positive slope from the foundation of the house away, which is how the building code deals with it. And I think you have to be careful about elevate. We have elevations in town that are, 14, 15, 16, 20 feet above sea level and requiring an 18-inch freeboard on those houses. I don't know that that's really getting us where we need to be. I think we need to focus on the 100-year and 500-year floodplains personally.
So again, I guess I'll ask if we have these in the scheme that Brent put together, the 1 through 4, and it sounds like we're knocking 3 and 4 off. The base flood elevation that we get out of the flood insurance study, I'm just curious how that plays out. These are, again, only in areas that are in the 500-year floodplain, basically zone X shaded.
Correct.
Okay. I don't know. I guess it's just the very flawed way that I look at this. The whole way to me that this makes sense is as the sea level is rising, there are going to be areas that are not currently in any shaded category of the FEMA maps that will be activated as the sea level rises. And what we determine now is how those buildings will be built, from now until whenever they rot to the ground.
Okay, so we've discussed and looked at even the worst case scenario, which I want to say is the 3-meter sea level rise projection that the state has provided based on the most current data. And when you overlay that on top of the floodplain, it was following the floodplain. It wasn't exceeding what we currently have as floodplain. So I know you're concerned about the properties not zoned that are in the that are currently not in the flood, but based on even the worst case scenario, based on the most relevant information, the sea level rise is not currently encroaching beyond the 100-year and the 500-year floodplain. And we've also recognized that sea level rise numbers are going to change, which then could push that into some of that, the zone X. But we also recognize that and this is what the draft is recognizing, is that the floodplain, we expect that to change as well, which will probably follow, the sea level rise. As the floodplain changes, that sea level rise they'll typically, I would expect them to go together. If the floodplain is moving further and further inland towards like the more center of the town from where it is, that's where the sea level rise is going to go as well. And I think
again, maybe this black box business, the flood insurance, the FEMA calculation today is saying based on past storm damage and our ability to monitor where water got to in past storms, we're predicting, we're setting up probabilities for storm damage into the future. But if there's one thing I heard every time I've been to a Rascal meeting, and Danielle, I'm putting you, I'm blaming you. I mean this in a kind way. The one thing that I heard was that FEMA doesn't look into the future. It's simply looking at past information to make its determinations. And the quote that I heard in the Rascal meetings was, the moment those FEMA maps are generated, they're outdated effectively in terms of looking forward in time. And yes, if we try to, you can't really compare sea level rise maps, as you just said, Janelle, with the FEMA maps, because they're looking at two different things. Yeah, within the FEMA map, the next 100 years sea level will probably fit within the current sea level within the FEMA map. But in 100 years, the equivalent FEMA 100-year floodplain and the equivalent FEMA 500-year floodplain will be much higher levels than they are now, based on sea level rise.
Freeboard and the sea level rise amount comes in. So putting this in place actually still keeps that building out of the future 100-year.
Correct.
As long as you're inside of the current mapped zone, in some shaded zone of the current FEMA.
So the land isn't a consistent slope either, so it's not going to necessarily creep at the same rate landward across that whole boundary. So some of it may move 10 feet, some of it may move 100. It's hard to tell.
Right.
Without a
hence
$200,000 full-blown model.
Yeah, that's why I've been referencing that piece that talks about locally determined topography.
Right.
Well, maybe we should ask Janelle to add something in there that says we're going to come back and probably address adjacent areas in some fashion by identifying special flood hazard areas that is, you know, maybe takes more discussion, but you know, we have a couple of things in the current proposal that say we're going to come back and add those later.
I think, yeah, I agree with Bob. That's a good parking lot topic because, again, right now we're just trying to get critical facilities and redevelopment on the books because we haven't even touched new development yet. And I know it was the thought of how do we get these two pieces in front of council for their consideration. And, you know, while we continue to work on this, because we recognize, again, we've been working on critical facilities and redevelopment for almost a year. This is an intense, time-consuming, lots of thought going into this because we want to make sure we're addressing the concerns. That, and also recognize we can amend code. You know, if we put something into place.
Doesn't seem that easy.
Well, the council adopted a code, and the same night they adopted a code, they said, go back and look at it. So, you know, there's always, and again, that's why we put those safety margins in there. That's why we didn't call out specific data, because we recognize that data is going to change over time, and we want to go with the most up-to-date information because we don't want this to be, because most code is time and a certain time and place, which is what the FEMA flood maps are. They're a certain time and place. But we also recognize they're going to change. So if we ever say, like, so we recognize it's like as the FEMA maps change, that's the information we go by. As the sea level rise, projections change, that's what we go with, because we have that. The data is getting better and better, and the information is becoming more and more. So we're relying on that as we move forward. And Danielle did provide that, and maybe in the future we can ask for some grant funding to help with topographic maps. But right now we go with the data and the maps that we have because that's the information we have. My crystal ball only looks so far into the future. And I think we've written this code as best as we can to look into the future. So I like the idea. I think I agree with Bob. It's like a parking lot idea. So how are we feeling about this ordinance, getting it back, discussing it next Wednesday? Are you guys comfortable with taking these two sections to a public meeting to get additional public comment and getting it to council so then we can start looking at that new development and those other topics? Or
I think I'm fine. I'm gonna stop pushing my points, but I think what's super important for whatever presentation we make in any kind of a public forum is that we have graphics, we have images, we have maps to support all the words that are in this draft. I think it's the only way that people are going to understand what we're talking about.
And I agree with Sumner 100% there. And at the same time, we have to take the design guidelines, because redevelopment is based upon them, to the Planning Commission, because you can't review one without the other.
And where are those in under this our little subcommittees?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, and they're referenced in section C, redevelopment. So.
Yeah, and I know we've discussed them. It's been probably a month or so since we've discussed the design guidelines. Do you guys want to tackle those today, or do you want to come back next week or the week after to tackle some of those?
Well, if we're going to take it to Planning Commission next week, we need to make sure that we're in agreement now on them. And I think the only open item, and I can't remember, Janelle, where we left this, was to make sure that there was adequate offset, that, you know, it's not just 3 items from the 2 categories, that if you're going to get 100 square feet of additional infiltration or impervious, you're going to offset 100% of that with the best management practices.
That's in here, like rainwater. I see that there's a minimum of 1-to-1 offset. I'm assuming that's by volume, by area. What is that? What does that 1-to-1 refer to? Is that a square footage or a volume?
Brent, suggestions?
It can't be by square footage, because they're not equivalent
so
units.
Volume of water generated.
It's got to be infiltration rates.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be the calculation? I have 1 inch of rain on 100 square feet, just as an example. I need an equivalent number of rain barrels for that volume, or I need an extra 100 square feet of infiltration somehow. What would you ask Robin to figure out?
This is the topic where the engineer would have to address that. So I'm going to look for advice from Brent, because as we said, all of these best management practices, when you submit for the building permit, would also go and get reviewed by the engineer to make sure that they are meeting the 1-to-1 offset. So I think Brent is going to, and I apologize, I'm putting you on the spot, Brent, but you would have the best idea of how to calculate that.
So I guess that we would have to pick, just to keep consistent, maybe the 2-year rain event, you know, whatever the volume is, the 3.4 rainfall event, and kind of have that, whatever goes into the bioretention, that volume of what that would come off of impervious. Because we're only looking at what, a 10% increase?
Correct.
The 2-year storm is the correct time horizon for this kind of thing, Brent?
Yeah, that's kind of the baseline that everybody uses as, that's where you're going to get your most bang for your buck in a bioretention or a BMP. Anything above that typically is overflow anyway. So if it's a 10-year event, you're only going to get the first 3.4 in treatment. And the thought process behind that when they created that was that 90% of rainfall events were under that amount. So you were going to treat 100% of 90% of events.
So I'm looking at the September 30th design.
Correct.
Standards, that's the correct one?
Yes.
Yeah, the only difficulty I see is that, and I agree, Brent, with everything you just said, and I'm okay with that. And for things like conservation landscaping and rain gardens, that all works. When you talk about barrels, rain barrels or cisterns, it's a little bit different because you're not actually infiltrating, you're capturing. And it all depends upon how they get used, because if they don't get used, they really have zero impact on capturing rainwater.
What would be a two-year storm volume of water that we would have to handle that could be multiplied by a surface area?
So it's 3.4 inches over per square inch.
Okay. So I'm just curious what the sort of back of the napkin calculation is for how many rain barrels it takes to handle 10% of a typical lot, say over on the beach, and do that in rain barrels. I'm assuming it's a fair number of rain barrels.
Well, again, you have to have at least 2 rain barrels, but that's only one item. You can't do all of your offset in rain barrels or cisterns. So you have to mix and match, because it's like, otherwise it's like you're just gonna have 100 rain barrels everywhere, and we want the mixture of those topics.
So, but in answer to Sumner's question, just so that people have an idea on size, I have a 1,000-gallon cistern, and it comes from my roof takeoffs. I have 1,000 square feet of the roof that's going to them, and a 1-inch rain vent will fill up the cistern. So in answer to your question, some just with volume, 1,000 gallons equals approximately 1 inch over 1,000 square feet. And that number may be off. I have to go back and look at my calculations, but I think that's pretty close to, where we are from an orders of magnitude.
And again, we're also trying to get pervious pavement in, other topics to get into, but we also need to make sure it's attainable for everybody. And some people, I know there's an attendee listening, really likes their rain barrels, uses them a lot. They have brought that up in the past. And again, we're just looking at multiple different topics. I was doing some research the other day, and I was listening to a presentation, and they were really big on, street trees. Street trees can actually absorb a lot of water and do that. So do we want to then add, like maybe the city needs to look at planting street trees in these areas to help absorb that water. One, it's also beautification. It helps with temperature and a bunch of different things. And how do we encourage those types of things? So it's just, I think every little bit gets us to where we want to go. And sometimes, it's an easier sell. Well, I need you to do a big thing over here. You can also do something smaller over here. And, I think it's just finding that balance.
I'm never going to argue the value of as many street trees as we can put anywhere around the city for all the reasons that you mentioned, Janelle. So sign me up for whatever we need to do to further incentivize people, the city and individuals planting as many trees as possible around the city. Absolutely. I see this comment from Nick Carter.
Yes. I wasn't trying to ignore him. I just wanted to make sure we got through this discussion first. Go ahead.
So yeah, I do have a question for Brent about this current draft of the standards. In terms of meeting the intent that we have here, do you feel that you could do an adequate job of calculating from the sort of the permutations, and I can imagine people might throw at you, that you could come up with saying, yeah, we're going to be able to offset a 10% increase in impervious surface?
Yes. given what we typically submit on a bigger plan, if you apply it to a house for what we submit to Jessica Soil Conservation, then if they do a very similar thing, then yeah, we can review it and it'll be proven very easily.
But the format and the details of the design standards as we've laid them out in this draft
consistent
will work.
Yeah, it's consistent.
Okay.
So that's just quick question. When we were on another committee, I believe it was, looking at the duplex question and lot coverage, what you found was most of them were under 55%, correct? Correct. So if a duplex can take up 55% or less of a site, you're probably going to end up, I mean, you're maxing out at 50 unless you do these extra things. So my guess is if people are doing pervious driveways to begin with, then they're going to be under the 50%. 60% on a lot is a lot of coverage.
I mean, when you drive around down on the beach now, the houses that are going up now don't look like they're 50% coverage. They look like they're considerably more than that.
So it depends on the driveway is the key.
Right, because the maximum the house can the house can have is 50%. The overall lot coverage is 65%. Again, we put it as 50%, but if you want to go 40%, we can do that and say then that 10% gets you to that 50%. We can do that. If we just put in a number, but if you want to reduce that impervious surface even more and go, okay, your overall is 40%, but we can get you to 50 if you do these extra items, we can do that.
I just wanted to clarify and get the absolute numbers on the record. 1,000 square feet at 1 inch of rain is 620 gallons.
So that's 12 rain barrels, 10 rain barrels?
Because the minimum size we said is a 50 to 55 gallon barrel. But again, that's only one component you can use. You've got to pick a couple others because you got to pick 3 out of 2 different categories.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, my recollection, and that was how we sized our cistern. So.
Yeah. And I'm also we've got a lot of people. We've got 6 people on attending. So I just want to make sure that information is going back to them.
Right.
So is it worth addressing Nick's question here?
Yep. If we're good, are we good with the design guidelines? Everybody's
as far as presenting to Planning Commission and hearing what they had to say, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Bob, you're good?
I guess I am. Yeah.
Okay. So Nick Carter had a question. A critical and vulnerable public facility is the Lewis wastewater treatment facility located in a tidal wetland. What, if anything, is your committee and or BPW doing about relocating the wastewater treatment facility? So I can't speak for BPW. That is a question for them. What we have recognized are critical facilities. And one of those critical facilities in this ordinance would be the wastewater treatment facility, city hall, fire stations, other items that are defined as critical facilities. And what we have suggested in the draft is not build them in the 100-year floodplain. And if you're going to build them in the 500-year floodplain, you're building to the 80-year sea level rise horizon, which is the 2100 year. And you also then have to include the 18 inches of freeboard. So that is how we have looked at that. But we have not.
As the member of BPW on the committee also, the wastewater treatment facility has a elevation certificate. It is several feet above the 500-year floodplain. So even though the plant sits down on the ground, there are no penetrations below the 500-year floodplain, and we actually have several feet of freeboard above it. So there's no plan at this point to consider moving the wastewater treatment facility. And because of it's not a risk, B, the cost, and C, where would you put it? So I hope that answers the question from the BPW perspective.
Tom, given the calculus that you just went through, I mean, that's exactly the kind of rationale that we're trying to sort of apply to other critical facilities, that we need to build a, what was the term? We need to build a greater safety margin based on the best available information that we have right now about what's coming,
right?
What we can predict on a certain time frame, what kind of appetite for risk we have over the, given the investment that a sewage treatment plant or a water facility or some larger critical facility, what it involves. That's the whole point of these different number of years and the corresponding sea level rise numbers that we expect. Why we've got these different numbers based on the sort of importance to the city and the lifetime over which we expect that they will operate.
So, and to Janelle's point earlier, the recommendation is not to build critical facilities in the 500-year floodplain. However, there are times like a cell phone tower has to be located in that 500-year floodplain, and then you need to mitigate. So you need to make sure that your critical electronics are above the flood elevation, because thereby you've controlled the risk.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead, Brent.
I'd also say that, a firehouse also falls under critical facility. And at some point you have to get the fire truck off that property in order to make it usable. So if we're elevating 8 feet, you have to make it, you're hoping that 80 years is sufficient. You're hoping, that the 0.2% chance never occurs. But if it does, you're safe. But on the 10,000 other days that flood doesn't happen, it needs to be a usable facility as well.
Well, and to your point on that, Brett, one of the things that the mitigation plans for the city has is that during like a major hurricane event, we at BPW relocate our equipment from the BPW facility on Schley out to safer ground. They do the same thing with fire equipment because that needs to be usable after the fact. And the other part, which you've made very clearly, is that, for the wastewater treatment facility, you don't have to get equipment in and out of it necessarily quickly. You have other means of getting there with high clearance vehicles, but a fire truck is a fire truck. So it's, you've got to look at each one of these critical facilities as an independent.
Yeah.
Well, if we were to pass this and it were to get through city council, what would be the elevation change for the wastewater treatment plant?
So
I'm betting it meets what Tom can answer, but I'm betting it meets what we're proposing.
Well, two comments. One of the ones is that it's not retroactive.
Correct.
And second of all, I have to go back and look at the elevation certificate, but as I remember, that plant was built before the new FEMA flood maps came out. And actually, contrary to what common knowledge or common sense would say, the flood elevation actually went down in that area. So, but I'd have to go back and look at it. But these regulations are not retroactive. However, we at the BPW are continuously looking at the risk profile.
So if say BPW or the fire station or whatever critical facility has to be rebuilt, and it can only be rebuilt in the 100-year or the 500-year, we've got that guidance into the code to address that. So
yeah, basically we build it higher. I mean, you just
yes,
have to move your penetrations up further. So
okay. Any other questions? Because I think we've got a really good draft ready to go to address critical facilities and redevelopment. I'm going to take some of those items out and then get that back onto the website. The item of how to calculate number 3 and 4 and how to calculate base flood elevation, as we've discussed, we'll take those out. And then I'm going to put that on, I'm going to provide the updated version on the website. And then I think you guys are ready to discuss on Wednesday and see at the Planning Commission meeting and see how comfortable Commission is to taking this, to moving this forward. Does it sound
again,
good?
I'm going to ask about relevant graphics, whatever presentation we think we need to make to planning and ultimately make to City Council. So
yeah,
what at a minimum must we have in order to convey this properly?
I think the one thing we definitely want to provide is the chart showing the current projections of sea level rise. And then if you want to show, again, you may not want to show the current floodplain, because that, again, is where this is going to apply. And I think those are the two graphics, if you're going to do graphics, you really do need, is showing, okay, everything that's in the floodplain, 100, 500 year, this code would apply to you. And this is the chart for the sea level rise for the projections, showing what the lower, intermediate, and the high projections are, and the fact that, you know, we were charged to go with the intermediate, and that this is what the intermediate and the high are. So we can have a discussion on that.
Maybe I'm the only one. For me, it helped me understand all these terms to have that figure that I've referred to a couple times today, the one that comes from page 102 of volume 1 of the flood insurance study.
I can have that if you want.
Think that'd be valuable? I mean, it's just a lot of different things to keep in mind, you know, because different people are going to identify with different parts of the landscape, and they know where they are, and they can imagine that distinction of either I am or I'm not in the floodplain, but they can all imagine where they are on, I would think, in that chart, in that schematic.
And the only thing about that chart, Sumner, that muddies the water for this is it shows one line for BFE. And we're actually talking about 2 BFEs, a 100-year and a 500-year.
Can you just put that chart up on the screen?
Yep, give me just a minute because I've got it up and I just need to.
So
yeah, because what this really does is just show the 100-year. This doesn't actually show the 500-year. But I think what you could do is.
The whole reason I brought this up was, to me, this becomes the basis for illustrating what we intend to do. We have to add additional lines to a graphic like this.
Right.
It explains what we're trying to do. And
I think it's very, if you look the upper right where it says BFE, if you put a sub underneath that BFE 100, and then we add a BFE on the zone X, a BFE 500 line, that would make the graphic, in my mind, much clearer.
But so,
and again, I think go ahead.
To speak to that 500-year BFE, you know, I'm assuming that that's a flat line that's just higher than the one that's identified in this graph that says 1% annual still water elevation. Am I right about that, Brent? It's just a higher number.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, I think if we just say this is just an example of the 100-year, because this doesn't show sea level rise at all. It's not showing any of that information. This is just showing floodplain. And
but that was why I was imagining, I mean, to be able to say in an 80-year scenario, we can determine from the best available science and the intermediate curve that the sea level rise factor is going to be X feet or fractions of a foot above that, those BFE lines there. That helps everybody understand what an 80-year scenario looks like versus a 40-year or 50-year. Maybe it's just me. I just tend to do better with these.
Not just you.
I just sent everyone a graphic from the Virginia flood risk page, and it has a sea level rise inundation area that shows the ground elevation, base flood elevation, freeboard, and then another number.
Janelle, can you pop that up on the screen?
Give me just a minute. Because I also had a graphic that kind of showed.
If we can just alter that, that might be.
Right. I mean, I'm not married to this particular graphic. It just seems to me that it helps to put all the terms in context. And I just want to make sure people get what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, in the greater floodplain conversation, it does. As far as, you know, building in shaded zone X, it's kind of off the page on this one a little bit.
Okay.
But.
Okay, let me.
But that's one of the reasons, Brent, why I've made so many points today. That's an area that to me is of particular interest, is the area where from the very first water workshop, we heard from, I can't remember her name, the insurance agent, O'Donnell, who said, 20% of our claims come from people that are in zone X.
Yeah. Well,
so it's just making people understand that just because you're in zone X doesn't mean that you're riskless.
Right. So it's a model. So, models are only as good as the information you put in. And like Tom just said, there are areas that went down. I was working in Cambridge when we had the last maps come out. We actually had, I think it was like 25 houses mapped out of the flood zone. It actually went down on the chop tank, which it just means that the model precision got a little bit better. So the number changed, but that doesn't mean you're not at risk. But
it is, after all, a model.
Right. So it's the, I hate to use the word industry standard, but it's the national industry accepted form of higher risk versus lower risk is the FEMA maps. So
Brent, I like the idea of what you just sent. And obviously, if we take the three that are stacked on the left side, which is sea level inundation, coastal, and outside of floodplain, and rather than putting the absolute numbers in there, if we just put what the unit is, sea level rise, freeboard, in those, this would be a good graphic to explain how you got to what the elevation is.
Those are clean, concise, simple.
Yeah. So, Sumner, what do you think about that?
I didn't actually look at the graphic. I was waiting for it to come up on the screen, so I'm pulling it up now. That's all I'm looking for, is something that helps us visualize this calculus of these various pieces, one being freeboard, one being the BFE, and the third category being the relevant sea level rise number based on the number of years into the future that we're looking. That's really what I'm looking for. And then anything after that helps us understand that there are these areas out on the edges of our current industry accepted floodplain maps where we may not currently be in it, but at some point down the line, you may very well be in there. And so, what we do with that is beyond my ability, but okay. So this works. These kinds of images that you've that come from Virginia, I think are great. And again, we don't have to put absolute numbers on there, but to be able to identify something as the safety factor that we we're adding to the scheme based on sea level rise projections, I think would be a very useful addition. I think the problem that I've been grappling with for quite a while now is the difference between the top four, the 2x2 matrix in this graph, and the bottom one that says outside of flood prone areas. And all I've been trying to say all along is that, you know, with the sea level rise predictions, the water's going to come up, and that those areas that are currently outside of flood prone areas will start to be in the flood prone. The construction will have occurred. The situation will be fixed as the waters rise. And that was all I was trying to get at was.
And it's hard. Believe me, it is. I used to coach soccer, and like I tell my kids, it's a process, not an event. So we'll go through the process of getting what we can do right now through on what's in the 0.2. The 0.1, the 1% is already taken care of. The 0.2 is getting taken care of, and then you slowly move the process out to address additional areas, and that's the next focus.
And you know, just to confound things further, I for whatever reason periodically bring up the FRAM map, the Executive Order 41 that the state did. I realize the state has its own process in terms of what investments it's making where, but I think if I understand it, they basically tried to say, what does the 100-year floodplain look like with 3 feet of sea level rise on top of it? And they tried to map that out. And you know, that paints a very different picture than what our current 100-year floodplain looks like. We are not bound by Executive Order 41. That doesn't mean that we couldn't be using such a benchmark in our planning. You know, again, I'm looking forward rather than worrying about what we're trying to do right now, but I think that's something we might want to consider looking at in the future as we're trying to refine what we've
I think definitely developed. A parking lot topic.
Fine.
But yeah, no, we hear you, we're with you. It's again, like that big puzzle we have. I think we've got a good chunk of the puzzle being addressed right here. Well, we've got to fit in, we've got those, you know, multicolored puzzle pieces that, you know, are going to be hard to find and put into the puzzle. Those are those areas. So, but I think we've got those edges and starting to move in addressed.
Danielle has an awesome comment, which I think is spot on. It says
yes.
Here, there's an outreach and education need. Risk does not go to zero if you are across the street from zone AE. This can be a recommendation, hazard mitigation, to do outreach on floodplain maps and risk. That's exactly what I'm after here.
Yeah, I mean, we all recognize there's a lot of education, even with this ordinance, a lot of education. There's just a lot of education that has to be done with sea level rise, with hazard mitigation, with, you know, stormwater management, flooding. So yeah, education is a huge part of everything we need to do, everything we tackle. So thank you, Danielle. So anything else for today? If you guys think of any other graphics, or Brent, you come up with any other graphics that you think would be good, send them my way. I'll do my best in a couple of days that I've got to get them put together so we have it. And then do you guys want to set a next meeting, or do you guys want to see and what happens after commission next week?
Well, let's set a meeting, because we're going to have to discuss either what commission sends back to us or moving forward on the new development. So
okay.
I agree with that. So what are we thinking, like 2-3 weeks from now?
Open my calendar.
So 2 weeks would be the 25th. I am not available. So March 4th.
So I see that mitigation meets on the 3rd. Is there a reason to, I mean, I think that would be nice for us to be able to maybe it doesn't matter. I don't know. But
They're good on the 4th.
Yeah, March 4th, I'm wide open.
I'm not good.
No. Okay.
The
2nd
or the 3rd after the mitigation meeting.
We would have to do an afternoon on the 3rd because there's already another meeting scheduled for the city on the 3rd.
I'm okay.
I'm game for whatever.
What time works? I'm free in the afternoon on the 3rd.
1 p.m.
1 p.m. Bob Sumner.
I can do that.
Brett.
I can do that.
Okay. I'll set it up for 3 at 1. It's a Wednesday. And I think also just start getting some ideas for new development coming forward. I know we've kind of gotten some stuff, but if something's popped in your head since then, keep that thinking about. And we did get one last comment, maybe beyond your scope, but what is the committee's position on beach replenishment and rebuilding portions of the Lost Dune? That is not the scope of this subcommittee. And I know the city has got other subcommittees and council working on that one, Nick. So anything else for today?
I have a question related to that. Is that mitigation? What committee would that be?
I think that falls more with, it could be mitigation, but I think it's going to fall with coordination between DENREC and the city council.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I
that's
don't
more
think
state driven.
Yeah, the mitigation doesn't take that up. That's not.
Yeah, I really think that's more of a much higher level at council DENREC discussions.
So Janelle, you'll be able to get us the final copies of the ordinance, the guidelines, and the
yeah, I think the guidelines are good because we really didn't change anything with the guidelines, and I just need to tweak. So hopefully this afternoon I will have you that revised draft as of today.
Okay, and then they'll get posted to the Planning Commission agenda.
The website, and then I will do my best to come up with items for. I got a couple of days because we are actually closed on Monday. To get some graphics and some maps. And if they're just graphics to just kind of give general information. But again, if you've got ideas, send them my way and then I'll put them together. So until next week for commission, we'll bring this up and then we'll see everybody on Wednesday, March 3rd at 1.
Thank you for patiently answering all the goofy questions I've been asking. I think part of the reason I've been asking them is because I know I have conversations periodic with people out in the neighborhood, whatever, and some of this stuff is just hard to get your arms around. I'm just trying to make sure we do it as clearly as possible. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Luckily, you have 2 CFMs on board.
Sorry, what's a CFM?
Certified Floodplain Manager.
All right. Till
So,
March, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Bob. Thank you very much for the minutes. We'll take them up next time.
Okay.
Take care, guys.
Thanks. Bye.